When I was around 5 or 6 years old, I remember seeing a figure of a woman standing outside of my room. The living room was the next room from mine. I always thought it was just light coming from outside the windows in the living room. But when I went up to the light fixture and tried blocking the light with my hand, nothing would happen. The light would still be there. I wasn't scared, because I wasn't aware of ghosts when I was around that age. But as I got older, maybe around 9 or 10 years old, I sometimes would sleep in the living room, on the couch, because my room would get really hot in the summer. Well, as I would lie on the couch, getting ready to fall asleep, I would hear things in the kitchen, like the sound of someone placing a glass on the table. I would sometimes go to see if anyone was there, but nothing would be there. I still hear the sounds in the kitchen sometimes, and when I would be home alone, I would sometimes go into the basement and watch TV or exercise. As I would work out or watch TV, I would sometimes hear footsteps above me, seeing how the TV was right below my room. But what happened to me 2 months ago terrified me. I'm 17 years old now, and it was raining harshly in the middle of April, and I was working on an art project in the dining room, which was the room after the living room. I was home alone at that time. My mother was picking up my sister from work, and my father was working. As I was working on my art project on the table, the lights went out, and as soon as they went out, in front of me, I saw a woman sitting across from me. I couldn't see her clearly, but she seemed to be smiling. About a second later, the lights turned back on. I was so scared, I ran into the kitchen and stayed there until my mother and sister came back. When they finally returned, I told them about what I saw, and my sister kind of freaked out because she hates hearing about things like ghosts and other things related to that. My mother told me it was probably just my nerves, and that I've been working too hard on my project. I believe what I saw was real. I don't know what this ghost lady is doing in my house, but she seems to bring attention to me only. This is just one account from over 40 experiences I've recorded in my ghost journal. It was a very unusual day in Chicago, only 4 days to the new year, and in the middle of winter. It was 63 degrees, yet the skies were dark, but there were tons of fluffy clouds. My friend Christine and I decided to enjoy this rare day and go walking around the park. We watched as the clouds seemed to spread across the sky and realized the storm was near. Somehow, the conversation switched to cemeteries. She told me of an old German cemetery that was near the park that she had gone to. They have a section of infant graves from the late 1800s to early 1900s. She knows the babies died in groups around the same times. After hearing this, I wanted to go see for myself. She told me where to go, and as I drove into the cemetery, I pointed to a corner and asked her if that was where they were. She said yes. I'd never been there before. I don't know how I knew. We parked on the road, got out, and looked around. Some of the graves were old and worn, the names and dates hardly visible. The baby section was so sad to see, and we figured there must have been a plague of some sort in the area. It was beginning to get dark, even though it was about 4 p.m. in the afternoon. The cemetery closed at 5, so we wanted to hurry and see everything before they closed and before the storm came. We were walking through the cemetery when it felt like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in a few minutes. I stopped in my tracks and noticed a familiar smell. The scent became stronger, and I realized it was roses. I asked my friend if she smelled anything. She said yes. I asked her what she smelled, and she said roses. I was bending down to smell the flowers on a grave, which were not roses. I wanted to figure out where the smell suddenly came from. Suddenly, my friend told me to look up, and in the distance was a flower girl. And you guessed it, she was holding onto roses. Both me and my friend were in disbelief. We couldn't even fathom what we were seeing, but yet here was this flower girl holding onto a rose, which had a strong perfume smell. Her attire was in a Victorian-style dress. She looked absolutely beautiful, but it was also really scary because it was in the middle of a cemetery and we were really spooked. Even though it felt like forever, she momentarily appeared and then she was gone, just like that. It must have been about 15 seconds, if that, but we both saw her, and we're not making this up. We're totally sane individuals who actually go out and try to see these things on purpose. I know that sounds crazy to some of you, but we get such thrills about ghost hunting. Anyway, we're not even done with the story yet, because right after, we heard the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard in my entire life. It was a scream right after she disappeared, and I'll never forget it for the rest of my life. It sounded like a human trying to imitate a wolf, as in, a human howling, but in a wolf style. I know that sounds ridiculous, and maybe it could have been a real human being trying to play with us. However, we did not stick around long enough to find out, and we bolted all the way home. I guess the moral of the story is, yeah, you can be interested in ghosts and whatnot, but even if you are interested, be very wary, and just remember, ghosts can't hurt you. If that was real, I have no idea what to say, but if it was a human being, I guess you gotta stay clear of the cemeteries. I'll tell you what though, the roses, the girl, and the scream, they were all very real to us. We did not hesitate to leave, because we did not know what to expect if we stayed longer there. Just remember to be very careful. Ghosts are crazy, but humans can be just as crazy. This happened to my fiance about 37 years ago in Karn City, Texas. He was about 5 years old and was attending a church function with his grandparents at the St. Paul Lutheran Church there. He was running around with two of his slightly younger cousins, having a good time. This function was taking place outdoors. Now, there were actually two church buildings there. A new church had been built, and the older wooden structure was still standing close by and being used exclusively for storage. The church had been collecting clothing and had put it in the older building. Anyway, my fiancé and his cousins had been told to stay out of the churches, but being little kids and the adults having their attention taken up with visiting, the boys decided to explore the old church. They went into the older building and looked into the large room where the clothing was piled on 3 tables. My fiancé said the first thing he noticed was the clothing on one of the tables agitating violently, and he could see a lady who just happened to be transparent, sorting through the clothes that were shaking. All that she remembers of her appearance is that she was a motherly or grandmotherly looking figure with a high neck dress and her hair pulled back in a bun. She did not pay any attention to the 3 little boys, but they ran out of the room as fast as their feet could carry them. He says that he may have been the only one to see the lady. He thinks the other 2 boys just saw the clothing shaking on the table. My fiancé says that he believes that the only reason the clothes were shaking was because of the ghost. The windows were all closed, there were no fans, and of course, no central cooling system in this old building. And remember that the clothes on the other tables were lying still. They went to tell their grandmother about the situation. Naturally, they got chewed out for being where they weren't supposed to be, and were told that no one was in that building, but they remember it well. This story is one that may or may not scare you. It's more of a mystery to me and my friends. When I was young, me and my cousin were always together and trying to scare each other. It just so happens that there was an old house which my grandfather had built in the early 1900s, which we thought may be haunted. It should be mentioned that I am from a small town in Virginia, and in the early 1900s, it was a pretty isolated town from the rest of the state. My grandfather was a pastor of the local church. Being that the church was very big, and my grandfather's house was, he would have wakes and funerals in his den. The house was very big, and there was plenty of room for people to attend these funerals. Anyway, my cousin and I used to see things through the windows which we could not explain. The house had not been lived in many years, when we would see these unexplainable lights. They were blue in color, and they seemed to go from window to window when we were looking at them. We finally got the nerve to sneak into the house, which probably wasn't too smart. Anyway, we had to enter through the basement in order for my father not to see us trying to get inside. This was very scary because there was no electricity, and we had to try and make it through the dark and up the stairs to the entry of the den. We did this several times, and on some occasions, we heard and seen strange things, and sometimes we didn't. On one occasion, we lived in the house, and we heard a tapping on the ceiling upstairs, as if someone was hitting it with a cane. This was very odd, because my father lived in the house as a child, and said his uncle lived with them, and he had a cane. When he needed something, he would tap on the floor for someone to come and help him. This scared the living daylights out of us, but my cousin was a little more courageous than I, and he persuaded me to go up the stairs. When we got there, he asked whatever it was that we were seeing and hearing to leave us alone in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. The sound stopped, and we left the house. My father was a little skeptical about the whole thing, but he felt that there may be some truth in it. He himself now saw a ghostly apparition which he can't explain. This is coming from a man who himself is now a preacher, and I don't think he doubts seeing this at all. I really feel that there is some connection to the noises and sightings with the funerals that were held in the house. There are other occurrences which have happened, but would take a while to tell them all. I've read in other experiences about blue lights being represented with the supernatural. The story may not be that scary to you, but to me and my cousin, we know that there is something paranormal about that house. Myself and a friend recently moved into a house in Belmont, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. The place is about 100 years old and retains much of the original woodwork, ceramic doorknobs, etc. I even found an old ceramic liquor and med bottle in there. It's a third-floor apartment with an old aluminum speaking tube to the second floor, which leads us to believe this may have been servants' quarters at one time. We never get anything but good vibes from the place, but a few things have happened which make me wonder, and I write asking your opinion. Firstly, the former tenant was an elderly alcoholic who, according to the landlord, used to heat only one room in the house, the dining room, with a space heater. She kept the whole place closed up, according to Miss Richardson, who also tells us the former tenants didn't die, but moved to a nursing home. We aren't sure if we believe her. Well, that room seems to have a door problem. Often when I return from work, all 3 doors to the room will be slammed shut, even the one which is tied open with a string. These are doors which don't close easily, being old and paint covered and wrapped a bit. While we hang out, sometimes doors slam. It happens in fits and starts. One week it happened every day, but it hasn't happened for a while. Granted, there is a breeze in that room, but the manner in which it happens strikes one as odd sometimes. Also, we have both seen a white figure in a long dress, and perhaps a veil, always in the hallway into our place, or in the doorway of the dining room. It is a peripheral vision thing, which leaves one looked at directly. I've seen it standing in the door several times, and I saw it seemingly walk down the hall once. It kind of bounced up and down like a person would were they walking. Mike tells me he usually sees it moving past the door, either coming into or exiting the apartment, and he has used the words wedding dress to describe its clothing. I didn't get that detailed a look, but I've definitely seen the shape. Visitors have seen a similar shape, but hesitate to call it a ghost. Lastly, and this is not so much an experience as a creepy coincidence, when first repainting the place, we decided to do the kitchen in blue and white. I proposed that we paint only the panels on the kitchen doors blue. We haven't done this yet, which both of us thought was a good idea. Later, when exploring the basement for the first time, I found an ancient door of the same style as our other doors, removed from the hinges and brought downstairs years before. It seems to be the one door from our apartment, which has been taken off the hinges, the kitchen door, and the panels painted years ago in cracked blue paint. Yesterday, my husband and I toured the Whaley house in San Diego. I think I may have been present to a supernatural occurrence of sorts, but I wanted to ask you about it. Initially, I started out on the first floor, not part of the tour, and I felt a markedly weird sensation in front of the dining area that I can only describe as having a sinking feeling that bordered on nausea. I felt fine walking around Old Town and coming into the house. I hung out in the dining room area for like 10 minutes, thinking what I was feeling was so unusual, and it dissipated. I felt fine again, so I looked around the rest of the house and felt okay, until I came to the first upstairs bedroom, directly right of the stairs. I again felt that same feeling, and I stood there, just looking about the room, and that is when I think I saw something in one of the mirrors, the mirror closest to the hall. It looked as though thin white smoke was being reflected into the mirror, as though someone was standing next to the mirror with a lit cigarette. I can only describe what I saw as smoke, because it curled. I also smelled a very faint smell of cologne that reminded me of violet water. I made sure it was not me, since I was the only person in that area, and it wasn't. It seemed to blow in through the saddled wooden partition. I was a little weirded out, because I was in disbelief at what I thought to be witnessing, so I called to my husband downstairs to come up. I didn't want to cause a stir, because I was unsure what this was. I even saw the presence of a shadow behind my back, in the corner of my eye. I walked back to the area in front of the room, and looked back into the mirror to make sure that it wasn't a reflection of something outside, like a passing vehicle, but I no longer saw the smoke. I really didn't want to tell anyone about the incident, because I would have winded up scaring everybody, including myself. I've been thinking about it ever since, and been trying to find a logical explanation for it. I've always been very interested in the subjects of ghosts and the paranormal, but never thought I would have a direct experience with them. Although I'm currently part of a theater group that is renovating an old theater, and we definitely have some spectral energy in the place, but that's another story. This story is about the first time I had something strange happen to me. I'm originally from a small island off the coast of Italy. The community dates back to 700 BC, so you can imagine they have their fair share of ghost stories. I was 15 and staying at my aunt's house with my sister. Our grandmother had died 3 years before, and as part of our week-long stay, we went to visit her grave. The experience was unsettling to say the least, and I think I was most affected emotionally by the visit. Trying to remember a woman who I love very much now, reduced to nothing but a picture in writing on marble mausoleum. Although it was a very hot and humid summer day, the cemetery seemed to have an unsettling chill about it, and I couldn't wait to get out of there. However, anyone who is Italian or knows of Italian cemetery visits is that they are family events that take a long time. Feeling very sentimental and depressed and somewhat bored, I couldn't help but look around and read more grave sites. With each name and picture that I saw, I thought more about the people behind them, their lives, and who they have been. The atmosphere seemed more oppressive, and I started seeing flashes out of the corner of my eyes. Nothing definite, but it was almost as if something had passed in front of me very quickly, and the experience left me somewhat disturbed. We left not long after, much to my relief, but still with this heavy, depressed feeling. Later on that night, I had fallen into a deep sleep, but was awakened at 3 in the morning by a male and female voice arguing. I was very groggy, but I immediately thought the voices were strange, because they didn't sound like they were coming from anywhere, in particular at least. They sounded as if they were right in my ears. The room I shared with my sister was directly over a busy main street, and being a summer resort, there is always some activity going on. However, the street this night was totally quiet, with no one in sight. The voices continued to argue in Italian, and though I spoke it, I couldn't make out what they were saying. Also, the intensity of the voices didn't change as I moved around the room. They always seemed to be in my ears, and were continuing to grow in intensity. At this point, I thought it was my cousin and her husband who were arguing from their bedroom. They shared the room with their 2 small children, and I thought what could be so important to be arguing at this hour of night, and why weren't their children reacting? I decided to investigate. As I slowly opened the door, the voices suddenly stopped. Not a cutoff in conversation or a conclusion, but as if someone had switched off a radio. I walked to the room and found the whole family sound asleep. I returned to the room dumbfounded, but found the room was very cold. The day had been extremely hot, and the night had not let up, and I was just in the room a minute before. But I knew the temperature had gone down at least 10 degrees. It was then I felt the same heaviness that I had experienced at the cemetery, and a large chill moved right through me. Almost immediately, the room returned to its original temperature. During this whole experience, my sister was asleep next to me, and when I asked her about hearing anything during the night, she thought I was crazy. To this day, I'm not sure what I heard and felt that night. However, I spent many nights in that room over the years, and never had a similar experience. Did I touch something or someone? And did they follow me back from the cemetery? I don't know. I moved into the neighborhood that I live in at the age of 12. I'm 20 now. Ever since I moved in here, I was told of the woods and the strange things that went on in it. Sounds of drums, voices, screams, etc. Needless to say, the woods is creepy, so creepy that I refuse to go there at night. Let me explain. The woods consist of 2 sections, the front and the back. It's the back part that scares the bejesus out of me. In '98, a girl was killed in the front part of the woods, where she was raped and left for dead in the cold next to the old tractor. A tractor that had been rotting there for at least 30 years. Well, since the girl was killed, there have been some violent storms that have taken their toll on the trees surrounding the area of the death. My friend and I would go to the spot every now and again, until that night. I had a girlfriend at the time that lived on the road across the woods, so to get to her house, you could take the short way, which was through the woods, past the spot where the girl was killed. I'd walk my girl home, and I was returning through the woods, when I felt a sudden cold draft. Now mind you, this is the end of summer, so there was no logical explanation to see my breath during this time of year. I then turned to look over at the tractor, and I felt an overwhelming sense of depression and sorrow that made me feel sick to my stomach. I started to walk towards the tractor, and I could have sworn I heard the crying of a girl's voice say, "Run away." At this point, I started to pick my feet up and walk a little faster, when I noticed a little girl standing from a distance behind the tractor. She didn't look to be more than 6 years old, and looked about as solid and real as anybody I'd ever seen. I froze in sheer terror, knowing that there would be no way that a 6-year-old girl would wander off into the woods unsupervised and by herself, especially knowing the history of these woods. As I got closer to the girl, she ran further away and behind some trees, where she ultimately disappeared. It was not long after that I hightailed my butt back to the house as fast as I could. The next day I told my friend about what happened, so from then on, he walked with me each time I dropped my girlfriend off, hoping to hear or see something. It never happened to me again, but months later, I was talking to a friend who still hung out in the woods, and he told me he was sitting on one of the fallen trees, and he heard a girl crying. He said it startled him, so he went to go and leave. Just as he got up, he heard a louder voice say, "Why?" He said he felt depressed and ran the rest of the way out of the woods. The woods has had a lot of strange things happen to it, like fires that start and go out by themselves, houses adjacent to the woods that have their backyards vandalized, and the sounds of someone knocking on the back doors. Interestingly enough, I found out that there was a forgotten cemetery somewhere back in the woods that had been neglected for years. I don't know what kind of paranormal energies take place in these woods, but I don't want to discover more of it. My parents still live in the same house I grew up in with my older sister. My experiences with ghosts began at about age 8. One night, I'd just gotten into bed and was waiting for my dad to come tuck me in. The lights were still on, and the whole family were upstairs. I wasn't alone or anything. I was wearing a nightgown. Suddenly, I felt two hands run quickly underneath my nightgown, up my legs, and over my body. I screamed bloody murder, and my parents came running in. I don't remember if they believed me, but I never slept in that room again. I traded rooms with my sister. Once she had begun sleeping in that room, she would tell us in the morning that someone would sit on the bed and say her name while they rubbed her head. But she never opened her eyes during these encounters. A few years later, I was getting my dad and I some ice cream in the kitchen. There was a new big bag of candy on the counter in front of me. Suddenly, it flew across the counter. I ran and told everyone. They believed me when they saw the candy on the other counter. Another time stayed home sick from school. I was lying in bed watching TV, and I kept hearing what sounded like marbles being dropped in the attic right above my bedroom. I was so scared, I called my mom, and she sent her friend over to stay with me. To this day, the TV in our kitchen turns on and off by itself. My aunt reported hearing music being played in her family room when everyone else was outside. Last weekend, my family gave me a bridal shower at my parents' house. When I got the pictures back, almost all of the pictures have orbs in them. I could not believe it. Whoever it is still there and still trying to be a part of us. It was my first time going to the Gettysburg War site. First, we visited their museum and looked at old clothing and war supplies. Then it was time for the tour of the battle site. It started off regularly, the guide showing us all the memorials and explaining this and that. Then it was time to get out of the car and look out over a field where a charge was made. It was a nice view stretching out before us, and behind us was a slope with a grove of trees to the right. While the guide talked, I noticed sounds of what seemed like a great number of people yelling and screaming down the slope, nearer in the grove of the trees. It was quiet at first, but it got louder, then quiet again. Even the tour guide stopped for a moment to question what those sounds were, and I even asked the guide if there was a reenactment going on down there. He just looked at me confused and said no. Perplexed, I asked if he had ever heard those sounds before while giving tours, and told us that this was the first time he had heard such distinct sounds that sounded like battle cries. There was even a moment where I was standing there, and I could have sworn I saw an extremely faded apparition run across the field for a second, then completely dissolve. Somehow I was the only one who saw this apparition. We then moved on, and as we walked back to the car, I asked my mom later about it. She thinks it was where the Confederate soldiers mustered up their courage by screaming war cries before they went to battle. I've been trying to find stories similar to mine ever since, but I've found none. My name is John, and I've been a Civil War reenactor for about 4 years now, attending living history events and reenactments throughout the mid-Atlantic states. I'd like to tell you about an experience that my reenacting group had at Antietam National Battlefield, Maryland. My company, Company G, 96 Pennsylvania Volunteers, annually has a living history event of this famed Civil War battlefield. It was here that in September of 1862, one day's casualties amounted to 23,000, more killed, wounded, or missing in one day than the casualties in America's previous wars combined. At one point during the battle, one American was injured with every second ticked by. I'd like to note that this was the ground upon which we were camping on. To continue my story, we traditionally take a walk into the battlefield to a small lane known as the Sunken Road. Here, Confederates hunkered down on a road that had been worn down by years of wagon travel, holding off wave after wave of heroic Union soldiers advancing upon them. Eventually, the Union forces swarmed over the Confederates' right flank and fired into the rebels from down the road, driving them off. This is where we annually took a midnight tour, hoping to catch a glimpse of energy left from 1862. Please note that even though the park closes around 10 p.m., the rangers often allow us reenactors to walk around. This is because if we found anyone defacing a monument or even shifting a pebble, that person will be praying for a ranger to come by and save him. So this night, about a dozen of us strolled down the sunken road and eventually came upon a monument located in about the center of the lane's length. We sat down along the banks of the road to relax and take in the atmosphere. About 20 minutes passed with silence and a few pictures taken here and there of us around the monument. Soon, 4 of us, myself included, chose to walk the remaining distance of the road to an observation tower, climb it, take a few snapshots, then head back. So we decided to walk down to the tower, ascend a few flights of stairs, and took a look around. Meanwhile, back at the monument, our captain decided that everyone had better get back to camp, so he sent 2 men to go retrieve us from the tower. No sooner had those 2 begun to walk down the road, when the remaining few men heard shoes and heel plates, horseshoe-like plates we wear on our leather shoes, on the gravel and earth down the road. First 2 pair, then 4 pair, then 6, and so on. Equipment could be heard rustling around on the body: knapsacks, canteens, cartridge boxes. If anyone knows what it sounds like to have men marching on a dirty road with full gear on, it's us. The sounds continually crescendoed until one man sat up, looked down the road, and stirred the other men to listen. Just as they began to sit up and peer into the darkness down the road, the sounds faded away just as quickly as they came in. Another man jumped up, went down the road and looked over the fences and banks, only to find weeds and small shrubs. He figured that if this was some sort of ghost regiment, it may have followed those 2 men who had begun to walk down the road to the tower to fetch us. I also had another story I experienced firsthand during a sleepless night in an old gun mill. We also used to have an annual event at Gettysburg State Park, Pennsylvania. On the land is the Henry Homestead, including a mansion and a house whose basement was the gun mill. The house now is a museum to the Henrys, and the mill below it is open to see the machinery and processes of old-time gun making. The history of the homestead dates back to the flintlocks. Our event took place very near the homestead, and since it was going to be extremely chilly that night, the caretakers were kind enough to allow us to sleep in the house that night. Little did I know about the death that occurred in the house long ago. A young girl had contracted a contagious disease, one of those terrible, yet common diseases of the old days. She had died, and since it was thought that her illness could be contracted even though she was dead, the viewing of her body was not a traditional one. Her body was placed on a large windowsill inside the house, of a window outlet that protruded onto the front porch. This way, the viewers could stay out on the front porch and peer in through the windows to see her on the windowsill. Of course, nowadays, ghost stories fill the house. So now it was time to go to bed. You could say, more like hit the hardwood floor. Of course, the lucky guy I am, I got a spot directly to the large window and the windowsill. I laid there half the night, listening to each hour tick away on the clock in the next room. Eventually, I had enough, so I moved to a spot further away from the sill. I laid there for some time, and then heard something. The noise was coming from. It sounded like the downstairs. The best description I can give is that it sounded like an older lady mourning, or crying, possibly over the recent death of her daughter. It was not the house settling or creaking, as it continued for what seemed like years. Okay, well, maybe a few minutes. My house also creaks a lot, and it sounded like nothing I had ever heard before. Scared out of my wits, I frantically tapped on the leg of my first sergeant, laying just a few feet away from me. He awoke, and I told him to listen. He heard the sound too, but not even wanting to ponder over it, he nervously said, "Wonder what that was," and quickly laid back down. The sound soon died off, no pun intended. Sleep was pretty much out of the question now, so I laid there another hour or so, until I heard something else. This one is easy to describe. Imagine being outside, and two other people are far away from you having a conversation. You can make out murmurs, in tones and voice, but not individual words. Almost like being underwater, and someone is talking above surface. That's what I heard. Only it seemed to be between a lady and a child, probably a young boy. Again, the sounds came from below the floor in the basement. These didn't last as long, possibly because God answered my prayers for them to stop. That night, I heard every single hour chime by, and every minute crawl past, every second tick by on the clock. Needless to say, the next morning, I wasn't a happy camper. Hope you enjoyed my stories, and yes, they're true. I told them just as I know them. Have a good one. I was in an infantry company in Germany back in 1989 to 1991. We used what is called a Bradley fighting vehicle. It weighs about 51,000 pounds and looks like a tank. We were doing live fire exercises at night, and we finished about 2 a.m. I was driving a Bradley in a convoy of about 10 other Bradleys, returning to the motor pool. The drivers used a large night vision scopes to see by. It's like watching green TV, and the Bradley commanders use that one that attaches to their helmets. While driving, a commander is to stand on his seat so that half of his body is outside of the vehicle, so that he'll have a better view of the surroundings. At about 3 a.m., I saw a man standing by the dirt road we were traveling on. I figured he was one of the German range patrolmen, and that he was just waiting for us to pass. Right after the Bradley in front of me passed, this man walked right out into the dust of that Bradley. I hit the brakes to avoid hitting him. At the exact moment, my commander said watch out, but it was already too late. I knew I must have hit him. I didn't even see him come out on either side. My commander then asked me if I'd seen a man walk out in front of us too. I said yes, and then he said that he had too. But when he turned around to check for a body, there wasn't one anywhere on the road. This dirt road was about 50 feet across, and when we returned to the motor pool, we took a flashlight and checked the whole front end and found nothing. No blood, no piece of clothing. There was nothing. My name is Heather, and I live in Omaha, Nebraska. I've only seen a few ghosts or spirits in my life. Sometimes I do get the chills though, like someone or something is nearby. The first spirit I saw was when I was younger, about 13 years. My mother told me to go into our basement to get some candles, which wasn't unusual. We spent a lot of time in the basement, playing slot cars and electric trains, and my dad has a workshop down there for models. As I fetched the candles, I felt watched. I scampered back upstairs, startled and panicked, and told myself not to be so silly. I give Mom the candles. I don't remember why she needed them, and felt a nagging, watching feeling again. I opened the basement door, and a round, green-white light was bobbing slowly up the steps, I think about 3 to 4 feet off of the ground. I grabbed my jacket and ran outside to my grandma's house down the hill. I never saw it again, whatever it was, and everyone laughed at me for it, but I remember it clearly. It was green and glowing with a soft white light. Mom laughed and said it must have been a glow-in-the-dark Halloween candy bucket from the size and color, but she couldn't explain how it was floating. My house is quite old, about 80 years, and nothing like this has ever happened again. We're the third family living there, and nothing violent ever goes on. I still get the odd feeling, but it's never been strong enough to make me panic again. The second spirit I saw really floored me. I was 14 and was riding my bike around town since it was a nice summer day, and I ended up on 2nd and 22 in Q, about 3 miles from my house. There's nothing there but cheap houses, and it's not a bad neighborhood, but it's not the richest in the world, but it's not a cheap, run-down area. Just relaxed, second-hand. Nothing violent ever happened there before. It's become a run-down area now, and there was no graveyard, or ancient Indian burial ground, or anything that I, or anyone else knows of. I wanted to go to Dairy Queen on 24th and Q, and I was behind it. As I came to 22nd, I saw a flat field, where I knew there should be houses. It was filled with what I can now describe as short, rectangular tombstones. I saw a woman standing there, dressed all in browns and earth tones. I couldn't even see her face or hands. She had a headscarf on, and her hands were held in front of her, covered by her sleeves. I think she had on brown shoes, but I don't really remember her having feet or not. I'm inclined to think not. I asked her what this was, but she didn't answer. I turned back to the graves, which had vanished and replaced with the things that should have been there. Streets, houses, sidewalks, trees. I turned back to the lady, and she was gone. I had a very chilly, uneasy feeling, and a few dead leaves fluttered by. I rode away, as fast as I could. I once saw a strange figure in the mirror, a girl my age, 13, but with dark brown hair, with thin bangs, and braids past the bottom of the mirror frame. She just startled me, but caused me no harm. The last one I saw left me breathless and thrilled. I was staring out the window to our front window when I thought I saw something in the clouds. It couldn't have been lightning because it wasn't fast enough. It resembled very slow lightning. It was white and long and crooked. I got up and tried to stare out by the light. It was at a bad angle, so I stood up and walked to the front door. As I peered out the glass, I saw a flash of lightning and a giant pair of silvery white eyes, rimmed with blue, which then vanished in a flush. The outside of the window was covered with condensation, like breath, which smelled really sweet, like milk. I wiped it away. I've come to the conclusion that the first 3 were just random encounters, but the last one was a kind spirit, one that was looking in on me. I haven't seen anything so clearly after age 15, but sometimes I see holes in my vision, weird things. After rubbing my eyes and refocusing, they're gone. And sometimes I can hear odd noises and voices no one else can. I don't think I'm psychic or anything, but I do think I'm a little more sensitive than the people around me. I know, you may not believe this, but it happened. It's true. Thank you.
The following ghost story is really my mother's story. She passed away in January of 2000, and I've been intending to tell it for some time. While we never did actually live at the Fort Bridger Historic Site, I did basically grow up there. We lived just across the street, and the site was my playground and home away from home. My parents, and later my sister and I, beginning about the age of 5, were involved for a great many years in their living history program. My whole family has always been aware of the various hauntings at the site and pretty much accepted them, with one exception. One night, when I was about 11 or 12, Mom came home, wet up to her hips and very frightened. She had been working late at the museum and took the North Parade Ground path and North Bridge across the stream, basically the long way, on her way home, intending to check the officers' rows buildings on the way home. As she was crossing the bridge, she heard the splashing sounds in the stream and what sounded like a young child crying for help. She waded into the shallow stream, vainly in search of what she was certain was a little boy drowning. She was never able to get close to the sound, and without a flashlight, found it impossible to locate him. Unable to find the child, she ran back to the museum to get a flashlight and get the curator who lived in the back apartment. When they returned to the stream, there were no longer any sounds to be heard. For more than an hour, they searched up and down the stream, both on and off the site grounds, before giving up. At locations at both ends of the stream, there are fences in the water, which would have caught anything had there been anything to catch. Needless to say, Mom was very upset. For years after that, she refused to cross the grounds alone at night. One night, about 10 years later though, she found herself crossing the bridge alone again, and once more heard the splashing and yelling. Again, she searched the stream. This time she did it alone and had a flashlight. That's when she noticed the presence of a young child struggling to stay above the water. The child didn't look solid, was completely faded, and disappeared before she could get any closer. In 1995, I had graduated from college and was working my first job as an archaeologist for the Historic Association on the excavation of the original fur trading post. As the de facto resident archaeologist, my partner and I found ourselves working all over the site, and were doing some research on the location and design of the post hospital, which is now gone. In going through microfilm copies of the post surgeon's records, we found a log and death certificate of an 8-year-old boy who had drowned in that section of the stream at night in the summer of 1873. As far as I know, Mom is the only one that ever heard his cries for help, almost exactly 100 years too late, as far as I can tell, though I'm not exactly certain of the dates on which Mom heard them. Hello, my name is Isabel. I have a few experience with spirits, Ouija boards, and unexplained happenings. This one experience happened while I was living on Bank Street in Ottawa. It was a co-op building, and it was my first apartment. It was an eerie looking building. A lot of people who didn't have much money lived there. I was on the 15th floor. It was apartment 1510. I didn't sleep there much, once I had found a girlfriend. I remember I would always sleep on the couch in the living room. I was always too afraid to go into the bedroom, and even while I was asleep on the couch, I would wake up feeling as though someone was watching me. Someone was hanging over me. I felt this presence almost every night, especially right beside the couch. You would be sitting there watching TV, or just relaxing, and you would feel as though someone was standing over you. I've had company tell me about it. I thought I was paranoid, or just scared of being alone in the apartment, but it wasn't just me. Right before my year lease ended, I had a friend move in with me for the last 2 months. Her mother was gifted. She was able to read tarot cards, leave her body, and visit other places, read the crystal ball. In many ways, she was psychic. She was also a strong believer in God. Natalie, the friend that I had move in with me, told me what she felt was a presence as well, the same things I felt. I remember when I was living alone, I would leave for work and come home at night. Everything that was around the tub would be inside of the tub. The shampoo bottles, soap, and stopper for the tub would be neatly placed in the center of the tub, still standing. I thought it might be my cats, but when it happened on more than one occasion, I started to get freaked out. I remember going to the bathroom, and Natalie was in the living room. I was talking to her, and there was a book on the side of the tub.
There was no reason for it to fall because of the way that it was placed. It fell at my feet as though someone had knocked it over. There was a presence in that area, nowhere else. Another experience happened while my roommate and I were at work. Manon was very skeptical about all that went on in the apartment and didn't believe anything that Natalie or I said. I gave her the keys to my apartment and told her that we would meet at my apartment after Natalie and I finished work to have drinks. She was putting the beer in the fridge, and she said that she was worried about not getting a job offer that was available where she was working. She didn't even remember what I had told her about the apartment. She said she was putting away the beer when she heard something slide across the bathroom floor. It was an empty plastic container. She said she seen it in there when she came in, but when she heard something slide across the floor, she remembered. She looked towards the bathroom, and there it was, still sliding by itself, across the room. She was so freaked that when Natalie and I got back from work, Manon was standing outside my apartment door. She told me what happened, and she believed me. She couldn't leave because she left in such a hurry that she forgot her keys and my keys. She was too afraid to go back in the apartment alone. She waited for an hour or so for us to get back. Natalie and I were in the apartment one night. I only had one bed, and the couch was too small for her, so she slept in my bed. It was only temporary. I heard something in the room. I was half asleep and asked Natalie if she was changing into her PJs, because that's what it sounded like. You know, the sound of someone taking off their clothes? That kind of brushing sound? Well, that is what I heard, but I couldn't see a thing. And Natalie said no. She kicked me and said she was right beside me and never moved. She asked me if I heard something too. She said that she heard some sort of ticking sound right beside her, as though someone was tapping their fingers on the wall impatiently. We felt such a strong presence that we left the apartment at 3:30 and slept at her friend's house. We were so freaked out we couldn't stay. We asked the spirits to leave, but the more stern my voice was, the more angry the presence became. It made us so uncomfortable that we left. Natalie asked her mother to come and chase them away. There were 3 spirits in my apartment. 2 were black spirits, very evil, and one was of an old man who had died of a heart attack. He was a short old man. I saw him once. He was sneaking into the bedroom while I was watching TV. I was afraid of him because it was a ghost, but Natalie's mom said that he was a very friendly ghost and quite funny. She said that he protected us from the 2 evil ones. She chased him out too, but he found a way back in. Diane is Natalie's mother's name. She told us the spirits were gone, but we still felt a presence. She finally told us that the old man would not leave. She was blessing the room and putting holy water in the shape of a cross towards him, and he was mocking her. She found it funny and knew that he was not a bad spirit. I let him stay. I would say hello to him when I got in from work and asked him not to ever let me see him. I never really seen him, but I did see a short shadow walk in the hallway and sneak into the bedroom. I told Natalie, and her mother said that he was very short, and it probably was him that I saw. It was a scary experience, and I hope to God to never have any more. I've had many others while I was living on the farm, outside of Copistan. Had experiences with the Ouija with some old friends. So many creepy things that I wish never happened. It's crazy how spirits can just roam wherever they please. Kinda scary even in broad daylight, don't you think? Always a skeptic, I scoffed at those who actually believed that anyone could make contact with the deceased. Neither am I particularly religious by nature, although I can accept that our spirits are distinctly separate from our physical bodies. So when we die, demised, our spirits must move on somewhere. Heaven and hell seem as good as any other names for those locations, but never, so I thought, could those spirits return to Earth. Even with the passing of 3 years, I can still vividly recall every detail that soundly changed my opinion forever. It was the late winter, early spring of 1998. My wife, soon to be known as my ex-wife, owned a home in Seattle, Washington. This home was located in a newly constructed neighborhood in which all of the residences were young urban professional, first-time homeowners. We were no exception. Seattle is, and has been for a number of years, a rapidly developing city. Therefore, housing is difficult to come by. We were thrilled to purchase this place, even before construction began. We bought a plot of dirt on which a home was to be erected, just all of our neighbors did. For clarity's sake, the houses were not built upon any ancient Native American burial grounds, pioneer graveyards, or anything of the like. The neighborhood certainly wasn't haunted, nor was our house. There was no prior history of the area where the houses are now to attribute any negative or evil energy to, and, as I've stated, the houses themselves certainly had no history, as we were the first owners. We had owned our home since the spring of 1994, and had experienced nothing out of the ordinary during our occupancy. Nothing occurred to set us apart from any other home in our neighborhood. Nothing, that is, except a failing marriage. We had married too young, and were still quite young. We had not taken the time to really get to know one another prior to our marriage, and had discovered too late that we didn't really like one another. Coupled with the pressures of long work hours, in an effort to amass material belongings rapidly enough to stay ahead of our neighbors, and well, I think you can all see where this is headed. It had become increasingly obvious to me that our marriage would simply not endure. By the beginning of 1998, our relationship had deteriorated to nightly arguments and useless consoling sessions. We both wanted out, but we had not fully accepted the idea. One late winter evening, in a rare moment of truce, my wife, her sister and I were just settling into the den to watch a video we had rented. The tension was finally beginning to settle in the air from the disagreement we had prior to her sister's arrival to the house that evening. My wife was seated at the end of the sofa, her sister in a chair next to her. I settled in from the far end of the sofa, near the patio door. I made a point to position myself as far away from my wife as possible, leaving a full empty center section on the sofa. As I was just about to push play on the VCR remote to begin the video, a strange dark feeling suddenly swept over me. My attention was immediately drawn to the patio door on my left. I sensed something. It demanded my acknowledgement. As I stared towards the door for a few mere seconds, I saw the heavy curtains rustle momentarily. Of course, the door was completely sealed airtight for the winter season. No breeze could even so much as seep through the economically sound weather stripping around that door. I knew that something was wrong. Moments later, I knew that something was terribly wrong. My estimate is that of 15 seconds passing since I first noticed the rustling of the curtains. Then suddenly, I felt and heard a swoosh of extremely cold hair around my face. It began from the area of the curtains and swept across my face from left to right. It stopped briefly in my right ear, and I heard a male voice distinctly whispering in my ear. The voice spoke rapidly, and I could not discern any words of the message. An instant later, I felt the presence move quickly away from my face and settle on the sofa in the empty space between my wife and I. I was stunned to say the least, and sat motionless for at least a minute or two. My rational mind was grasping, trying to determine what was happening to me. The presence was definitely not one of comfort, rather one of malevolence. As I sat in silence, mind racing, my wife calmly looked in my direction and stated, "Do you feel him?" As if her recognition made it all the more real, I jumped off of the sofa and took several quick steps away. As I shared what just happened to me with the others in the room, my wife's sister and I became increasingly agitated and anxious. All the while my wife remained calm, stating that she did indeed sense a male presence, but did not find it all that upsetting. Curiously, her sister did not sense anything. The room seemed to be as clear as I spoke, and as soon was void of anything other than the 3 humans occupying it. Several days passed, and once again, Everything seemed ordinary. We returned to our usual of petty arguments, which sometimes culminated into my opting to sleep in the spare bedroom. On one occasion, I recall waking from a sound sleep at around 4 a.m. to find my wife on her knees near the bed in the spare room where I was sleeping. She was simply sitting there, hovering over me and staring directly into my face. Her eyes seemed to gloss over, and she had a very menacing look. When I spoke to her, breaking the silence, along with the glossy look in her eyes, she simply stood up and walked back into the master bedroom. I followed only to watch her return directly to bed in peaceful slumber. Several more days passed. Things really seemed to be coming to a head. We had canceled our previous 2 marriage counseling sessions, and I began to make plans to leave the home. I had already begun searching for an apartment. One of the last nights that we shared a bed, I recall my wife waking me in the middle of the night. She was visibly shaken. This was quite rare, as most of the strange occurrences that were happening seemed to favor her. On this night, she stated that she had woken to find a dark, menacing figure standing near the foot of our bed. She described the figure as a mid-40ish male, with black hair slicked back in 1950s fashion. He had dark eyes and a cold, chiseled face. She further described him as wearing a dark sweater and jeans, and noticed that his body seemed to end near mid-leg, giving him the appearance of floating a few feet above the floor. The man did not speak to her, but she had an overall feeling that he was there on my behalf, that he was somehow connected to me. Although he wasn't overly protective of me, she did get the impression that he meant to scare her and would harm her if he chose to do so. His entire demeanor, according to her, was extremely threatening. At last, final days of our relationship approached. I was at the house one eve, packing some of my things for my planned move. My soon-to-be ex-wife was on the phone in the kitchen with a friend, undoubtedly expressing her low opinion of me. As I went upstairs to retrieve some clothing and other articles from the master bedroom, I felt quite uneasy. I even felt that I preferred to have my wife up there with me, rather than be alone. I simply tried to shrug off the feeling and return to the task at hand, telling myself that I would soon be away from the house of negativity. I returned to packing up my personal items. My back was positioned to the doorway of the bedroom, yet I sensed movement in the hallway just beyond the door. I turned slightly and glimpsed at something from the corner of my vision. I was convinced that I saw someone walk into the spare bedroom across the hall. I felt it must be my wife, and therefore called out to her. When I received no response, I went into the hallway and called out to her again. From where I was positioned in the hallway near the top of the stairs, I could hear my wife below me in the kitchen still engaged in her phone conversation. I turned and walked into the spare bedroom to investigate the shadow I had witnessed enter that room. As I stopped into the room, I knew instantly that I made a very bad decision. The room was freezing cold, and immediately upon my entry, I felt assaulted by an unfriendly presence. I looked around the room and could see absolutely no one or anything out of the ordinary, but I could definitely feel it. My attention was drawn to a crawlspace entrance in the far corner of the room. I stared at the door to the crawlspace for several seconds. Then my attention moved rapidly to the closet door. My eyes remained fixed in a straight line as they moved from the crawlspace to the closet. I felt as if I'd just witnessed something dart across the room without actually seeing it. I slowly walked to the closet door and opened it. Just as I had the door partially opened, I felt a blast of cold air, so cold that it seemed to take my breath. Then, I realized that in fact, my breath was being taken. I felt as if someone was literally sucking the air from my lungs. I could feel pressure on my chest and mid-back at once, as if being pushed by unseen hands from both the front and back. This feeling was extremely physical and not imaginative. I literally could not catch my breath. I finally gathered my wits and ran from the room, slamming the door behind me. I slept very uneasily for a mere 3 more nights in that house before I finally moved out forever. My wife and I separated and then divorced several months later. I have no real explanation of what happened in the final months that we owned that home, other than to say that the negativity that we shared between us seemed to attract other negative energy. I've lived in several locations since moving away from that home, and have never experienced anything like that since. I would caution anyone reading this to ensure that you keep your home a safe haven. I've since learned to treat any residence that I occupy with due respect. Even though I'm no great follower of spiritual beliefs, I do occasionally clear my home with affirmations and smudge sticks, just to be on the safe side, and never, I hope, will I again to be party to opening myself up unwillingly as a portal of negative energy. Holy mother of flapjacks! It's you guys. Boy, am I glad to see you. I had the terrible nightmare. I dreamt that I was on vacation and I couldn't record to you guys. And, oh shoot, I am on vacation. And I'm not there to actually respond to your comments as best as I could. Darn it. Okay, guys, I can figure it out. Okay, if you guys come to Seattle, you'll find me right there. And I'll be there. And you can find me and I'll, find myself. I don't know what I'm saying, guys, but thank you so much. As you obviously know, I'm on vacation right now, and this video was for you, and hopefully you enjoyed the compilations. I should be back to normal and back to my regular routine by next week, so you get the actual privilege of listening to more narrations that are real, true scary stories and unheard of. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this compilation, and I don't know why I raised my voice, and I'm so sorry, guys, but I gotta go. I'm having fun right now, but I haven't forgot about you guys. And I love you so much. So please comment in the comment section below. Let me know that you're still here for me. And I'll talk to you guys later. So good night, good morning. I'll see you in the next video very soon. Bye-bye.